Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-Federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right. And this is Tom the Bullish, your host, and I am again delighted to be with you, as I always am, because as we look into the mirrors of history, we get an opportunity to try and understand what in the world is going on in our present time, and what was it that the intention of the founding fathers might have been that we're just not getting today. We're just not seeing yet. So, what I wanted to do is, as I was preparing for this program, I was looking through none other than the Federalist Papers, because we have to. We have to understand what was it that convinced so many people that this Constitution of 1787 was worth going in and committing to, in covenanting with. And that's something we're going to follow up from last week. We're going to talk about what is it that we covenant, that we come together as individuals and make decisions to put ourselves in a place that others have legal jurisdiction over us. So I kind of called this one for no other reason. Well, yeah, I do have reasons. I always have reasons for everything. But the reason on why I'm calling this the law part two is because I wanted to expand for you not only what is important out of the Federalist Papers, and the piece in there that I wanted to bring to your attention is a comment by Madison in relationship to none other than what you're hearing the arguments over right now, especially with all of the leftists out there, is that college, and not a university college either, but the electoral college. So I want to bring out a concept for you that has total relationship in everything that we'll be talking about, as far as the law, as far as submitting to an authority, as far as how does that system work? What does it mean, again, as we talked at the end of last week around covenant, and what does that mean? Where I'd like to start, and the meat of this probably won't get to until segment number two. So, all of those that are listening at Dr. Spalding's program here at Soaring Eagle Radio, I would recommend that you go to the archive at samueladamsreturns.net and that you take a look there to hear the whole segment. Either watch the video or download the podcast. Please subscribe there, or even on YouTube to take and get the programming, and subscribe to get the newsletter at samueladamsreturns.net. I just need to have you do that, so we can really talk about more information. You get information as it comes out with the promos. But let's start out a little bit more regarding the organization that I talked to you about last week. I've just been reading a lot more of their meat, because that's what it really is. It's meat. It's meat that we don't get where we should be getting it in our churches, quite frankly, because you're not going to get it in the educational system. You're not going to get it at universities. And for you that are either aspiring to the law, or those of you that are already a lawyer or a judge or a politician, I would encourage you to go to lonang.com, LONANG.com. That stands for what? What did we say it stood for last week? Is what? I can't remember. What you think? Oh, we'll go back to it. It's lonang.com. The law of nature and nature's God. And what did that mean from the founder's perspective? But let's talk about a strategic plan that goes back to something that I mentioned in 1870. And from that whole mirror of history, we quickly saw, and I've spoken about in other programs, is that here it is, 1787. And in 1787, if you try and chart it out, we are going through the what? The Constitutional Convention. The Constitution then gets ratified in 89, and immediately we have to put in some amendments so that it becomes an amended constitution right off the bat with a Bill of Rights. And that is something that the Anti Federalists would agree to the ratification of the Constitution based on the fact that there would be a Bill of Rights. Again, Sam Adams, he was adamant. Massachusetts was at such a thin line of taking and voting for ratification. It was amazing. It really took people going and making very strong commitments to Sam Adams that there would be amendments offered to the Constitution so that the ratification would go through, and so that Sam Adams would give his head nod and say, okay, he can accept the Constitution based on the various amendments, especially with the Bill of Rights that he came into being. So at that point, we see until the mid 1800s that things were functioning in so many different ways based on the moral context and understanding of law, of truth, of fundamental principles for governance that were biblically sound. They were biblically sound. As I mentioned last week, that the educational system for lawyers was very succinct. And that's why I always point to where the flag is now. Those of you who are listening to the podcast can't see my hands, but I'm right here by the star field of the American flag over my left shoulder, where someday I expect to have that JD degree hanging somewhere back behind the flag, if you will. Never going to happen, but that based on how law and law schools were during that early period, you know, I should have a degree, a law degree. But to that point is that I mentioned, and I didn't have the name in hand in 1870 when we saw that all of this ideas of universalism, of socialism, if you will, were starting to creep in from the continent and starting to fill the minds of the educators, and to which we saw with Jefferson wanting to bring in great minds from the continent down there to Charlottesville, to the University of Virginia. And we start seeing that happening all through those 1830s, 1840s, that things were happening at the university level, things were happening in the churches, and people were moving away from the substance of the Reformation biblical truths. And we saw the increases of those who were going after all of these other theological stuff, to the extent that then in 1870, remember 1848, we had what? The Communist Manifesto. So that was already here. There were other things that were happening in the archives of the programs, and maybe one of these days I'll get back to it. But what we had in 1870 in American legal education, the name of the person is C.C. Langdell. Langdell became the dean of the Harvard Law School. And I'm quoting from, at this point, the lonang.com. It is on the vision for legal education regarding the Simon Greenleaf University Strategic Planning Committee report on the law school subcommittee back in 1992. And there's a number of things in here. But anyway, I just got the 5-minute sign from Kath. Langdell became that dean, And he introduced, as I mentioned before, the case law method, which then revolutionized the study of law to the extent that throughout the United States, it became more important then to introduce students to this new faith about the law, namely that man could engineer law to suit his needs as they changed from time to time. And that became the beginning, if you will, of the mental deficiency and tragedy regarding the living Constitution. Not only that, during that whole time frame of the 1750s and 1850s and 60s is the whole social gospel movement. So this is where humanism was starting to capture the minds of men, and that extended then into the political arena from, again, the pulpit arena, and extends into then the legal arena. So now man can engineer it all as they believe, and a result that the belief in evolution, not creation, and in man, not God, as the source of law, has come to dominate legal education in America. This belief about law, called positivism, positivism holds that social engineering through law is the key to the salvation of society. We see that every day. We see that in every political move. We see that in education with social emotional learning. We see that in all of this mental health stuff that is now being promoted. And it gets into what we'll talk about in the third segment. Where is that moral continuity from a basis of God's law versus what man makes up on some kind of solution basis that they think what? They think that they can save the world. One of the other quotes is actually from a J. Reuben Clark Law School at Brigham Young University, and it says this, is the church-related law school has a unique opportunity in at least two respects. It is totally independent, and it is free to emphasize that there is indeed a moral basis for our fundamental law. And it is free to examine and explore whether it is sound education policy to train people first in the skills of a professional monopoly and leave it to some vague, undetermined, unregulated, undefined future to learn the moral and ethical precepts that ought to guide the exercise of such an important monopoly in a civilized society. Well, it's very interesting that it came from that source. When we try and look now, and what is really brought out in Lonang and in this whole report is that the premier Christian or religious schools, including one of the primary Catholic schools in the past, uh, it has walked away from that distinct understanding of God's law that is extensible in everything. Therefore, what has been the move, especially since, say, 92, before 1870, 1992, when this was written, 1975, when that quote was made, to the present, what we see is that humanism and the ideas now, in particular, of worse, socialism and communism, are the key points that are in the educational methods required within law school. And to the extent then that constitutionalism and covenant and relationship don't matter, so your rights are assumed to be from government and not from God, which is definitely backwards from that of the Declaration of Independence. So we've come a long way. And to bring this back, once again, I have to say, and we'll continue on, is that it has to be derived within the pulpits because the pulpits gave it away. And remember, Harvard was what? At one time, it was producing ministers. But yet, the political thinkers, like Sam Adams, John Adams, and many, many more, understood the truth in that full biblical context of the Reformation. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. They got it right. And as I always do in this segment, I want to definitely thank Liberty Works Radio Network for having me these many years on this programming. I so much appreciate it, and so should you. There's so much great programming during the week and all of the live programs that you can call into and participate in, and all the various other educational formats and various formats that are available here at Liberty Works Radio Network. And I want to thank Dr. Mike Spalding for also having me on Soaring Eagle Radio. And those call signs I always forget, and that is WTTP 101.1 FM in Lima, Ohio. And please listen there and do what? You already know. Hit that donate button for both, because it is because of you. That's right. Because it's a double because. It's because of you, the listener, that these stations are on the air and that the programming is made available for your education and edification. So, highly encourage you to join in what is happening in these ministries, because in fact, that's what they really are. They're gifts of God to you to be able to then participate according to what you gain. If you don't gain anything, then why are you even bothering listening? So I get real persnickety about that. But the other thing that I'd like you to do is to go to nothing other than, yes, the primary place for all the archives is SamuelAdamsReturns.net. Definitely go ahead and sign up to get the newsletter. I don't bug you with a lot of stuff, and as you well know, I don't ask you for money. What I do ask you to do is to get the promo as it comes out for each and every program. Buy the 2 books that, for those that are watching this on video, take and get those 2 books that I have up on the bookshelf. I got a couple other things in the works, but I've been busy as all get out. And then lastly, if you definitely want to restore your digital liberty, go to eaglefiremobile.com. We've got some other things that'll be coming up here shortly with that. And I am a principal in that company, so I've got a lot to say there. Now let's get to what I wanted to talk to you about in the Federalist Papers, because it became very interesting to me, especially it is here in Federalist number, what is it, 35, 37, that Madison, in taking and looking at the issues about the Confederation, and then he was looking at the issues about the convention itself. He talked about that, in reviewing the existing Confederation, there were different things in there that everybody was looking at, and that it is a misfortune inseparable from human affairs that public measures are rarely investigated with that spirit of moderation, which is essential to a just estimate of their real tendency to advance or obstruct the public good. And you know what? Maybe one of these days I'll do a whole program on what is meant by the public good. The public good is not in the simple definition. So stepping back, I'm going to give you the simple definition on the public good. The public good, according to the founder's perspective, was your liberty. It is your liberty in all that means from the fundamental Reformation common law perspective. And that alone is a whole lesson unto itself. But that's kind of like the real nut of the whole thing. And he got in here and he was talking about all that was going on and what was happening inside of the difficulties that were happening inside of the convention. Again, he did it kind of like an outsider because they were sworn to secrecy. And you have to remember that Madison's notes of the convention did not even come out until after his death. So that was there from a secret perspective. And so he was kind of talking as an outsider, even though most people knew that he was there at the convention. And he talked about that the intentions of the first may be upright, as they may, on a contrary, be culpable. And what he was talking about is how do people look at things from a biased perspective? How do they predetermine uh, how they're going to investigate what is good, what is right, what should be politically motivated, how does it fit from a constitutional perspective, and all of that. And one of the points he brought out is persons of character will proceed to an examination of the plan submitted by the convention, not only without a disposition to find or to magnify faults, but will see the propriety of reflecting that the faultless plan was not to be expected. So the reality is that just don't poke holes in something. Remember that it was designed by fallible human beings, and if they don't have that full inside perspective, you need to inquire. You need to dig in deep, and I think that was also not. I don't just think, I know from reading all of the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, all of the notes on the convention, that the intention was that the federal government would act slowly on things so that they would take into full effect all of the considerations. So when I start looking at all of the various conversations that were going on here, it was, considering all the various principles, where did they look at the deficiencies within the Confederation? And then, what were they trying to do? What were the errors? How did they look at them historically? And then they went on to try to encounter what was encountered within those difficulties during that whole period, and trying to develop a type of form of government that would have the energy, and meaning the energy was the capability of executing those things that a national government should do. One of the interesting points that came out for me, not only in what he was talking about here in 37, but also what he was talking about in a couple other places, are the ideas that what holds the people for their ability and even their participation within the context of the states, and that the states, the argument being with the Anti-Federalists, that the states would be subsumed by the national government, which the Anti-Federalists were correct in that assumption. As we look today, we have this little bit of stuff in the states right now. But he brought out that the states and the state legislatures would have the direct decision-making process and power of electing the president. That was purposefully designed so that the states would participate. So the idea of the Electoral College is that we, the people, from that individual relationship perspective, would take and elect electors that would then take and dig in to find the most suitable person to be the president. This whole idea of campaigning and spending hundreds of millions of dollars on taking and trying to be a media insanity, which is perverted because of a perverted media in particular, does nothing for how we should function in this republic. It should be that we know people that we could trust locally and understand. And this is the whole wacky doodle stuff on lack of relationships within a community, lack of understanding who your neighbors are, lack of understanding who your local officials are, lack of ability to vote for those local officials in such a manner that they become meaningful. And again, based on the lack of good representation into the state legislatures, is such that the popular vote was never intended to directly elect a president or a senator into the federal government. The whole idea was that we would look at those local representation within the context of the state legislature and other electors that you could sit and have coffee with, that you can have a meal with, that you have a relationship with, that they would clearly understand the needs of the community in such a manner that when they went to take and look at who would be the best qualified person for president and understand constitutionalism, covenants, and how we should operate within the world, those people can make a decision. So, what we have now is a total perversion of our whole system. But our educational system hasn't done anything to help clarify that. Our educational system, in fact, has taken and brought in many socialistic and communistic ideas, philosophies, and perspectives into how we should be electing representatives. And to that extent, that goes back to what I said in the first segment. What is law? Not only how we represent, but how do we make law? What does that mean? And some of the things that Madison was talking about in 37, he talked about in 45, he talked about in some of these other papers, was that the federal government was supposed to be small so that the states were the key components. The states are the ones that have the dominant perspective on we, the people, in relationship to all of the various things within our lives. So that is part of the great complexity, is that we have now a federal government that is way bloated, out of shape. I mean, many of you on this programming already know that. I mean, that's part of the reasons that you're here, Liberty Works Radio Network, because you have that perspective. But we have allowed, because the churches have allowed the perversion of the educational system that started back in the 1850s and 1860s to the extent now that it becomes extremely difficult to communicate as to what are we supposed to be as a nation. I heard this past week, Dan Bongino say something about, well, what do you want to be as a nation? What do you want to be? Well, that's not the right question. The right question is, what did the founders intend for this nation to be so that we could be a free republic, so we could have our religious liberties, so that we would have our sovereignty not only as a nation, but as a people? As a people with individual sovereignty, to the extent that then we could be what? Sovereign states that come together, that take and covenant together within a national constitution for our safety and those areas of public good that were specifically delineated within the Constitution. That, my friends, is something that Sam Adams was well aware of, and the Anti Federalists as well. That's why they argued to the extent that they did, and that's why also we have a Bill of Rights, and that's why you'll come back for the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third and final segment today of the Law, Part 2. Samuel Adams returns those Anti Federalists. They got it right. And where I'd like to start off with in this segment is kind of a lead back into segment one a little bit on Lonang, that is the law of nature and nature's God. And in that particular section that I talked about and I referenced in the promo, that and what you'll see in the notes at SamuelAdamsReturns.net, is a vision for legal education that Lonang had put together in respect to the Simon Greenleaf University Strategic Planning Committee report of the Law School Subcommittee of 1992. I wanted to give you another quote here, and this was interesting that they have in there, and it goes like this. This is the answer that President Kennedy gave at his first inaugural address in January 20th, 1961. And this is the year that the Berlin Wall was constructed by the communists as a symbol of their asserted power to crush liberty. We have a lot of that going on today, and it's because of many of the things that I've talked about in the other two segments, but we have a very strong assertion at this present time by the socialist, communist, and the Democrat Party in particular, that are trying to take and now manipulate all that has happened in the various law schools, all that has happened in taking and making that transition that I talked about in segment one, from understanding that law comes from God and not man, and that what we have for rights and liberty come from God and not man. And very important that I'm not going to have time to mention here is under covenanting, which means participating in society with other people, in relationship building, in taking and then submitting to a form of governance, be it local, state, in your home, or even at the national level, is a covenant. You're saying, yes, I'll do that. And you're taking and backing down on some of those things that you have from as a natural human being given to you in totality by God. So here's what President Kennedy stated in a quote: "The world is very different now, and yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God." End quote. And then a quote from C.S. Lewis: "No generation can bequeath to its successor what it has not got." Interesting. If we are skeptical, we shall teach only skepticism to our pupils. If fools, only folly. If vulgar, only vulgarity. If saints, sanctity. If heroes, heroism. We shall admit that a man who knows no Greek himself cannot teach Greek. But it is equally certain that a man whose mind was formed in a period of cynicism and delusion cannot teach hope or fortitude. End quote from C.S. Lewis, and that was God in the Dock, 1946. I look at that in so much as that we do not teach constitutionalism. We do not teach what it means to be a real citizen within the context that President Kennedy quoted is that our liberties come from God. Too many young people believe that their rights, which then can be so easily taken away, come from government, that government is gracious. So when we look at everything that we have going on now with these red flag laws, what we have going on with gun control moves, with what we have going on even with our ability to speak, our ability to worship, our ability to stand up against evil and those who speak evil, do evil, and violate the very basics and fundamentals of our borders, why, you know, the government, those entities, those people in power can determine, what is best. And that goes from then the whole legal perspective and grounding is that you have these wackadoodle lawyers who are wackadoodles only because they absolutely believe the what they believe. And as Kathy and my friend Dr. Kimber would always say, is that people act according to what they believe. And when you believe that there should be no border because there is no fundamental concrete perspective of borders, legal determination, and sovereignty, then why not have open borders? If you do not believe that there is a sovereign God, how can you believe that there's a sovereign individual? How can you believe that there is anything to do with sovereignty within the context of a constitution? How can you believe that there's anything in sovereignty of property? You have no rights. Your rights are determined based on what is the perceived good of the society as it is now. And who cares what's tomorrow? Because it's going to change. And we'll figure out tomorrow when it changes. That is the mentality of those who do not understand the foundational perspectives of biblical truth, law, and the principles upon which our founders established constitutionalism and going all the way back to Magna Carta. Okay? So, with that, we have to look at a couple other things that I wanted to incorporate from Lo Nang. Is that here's a quote from Carl Henry. And it's a little bit of a long quote, then we'll jump back into Madison for a moment. Is that the challenge for those that are trying to take and determine a return to the foundations and fundamentals of law to which I was just speaking, with that undergirding that God is the giver of all law, both natural law as well as uh, individuals. And when I look at natural law, I look at it from the fact that I do have a physics background, a chemistry background. I have done work in optical engineering, photonics, as well as some other of the interesting sciences that are out there. And if I haven't, I've dabbled in comparison to those that I know that are out there. Uh, this is an interesting challenge. And the challenge goes like this: Christianity is quantitatively different, or it has nothing distinctive to offer the world. And I've done work in quantum mechanics. So when you look at what is quantitatively different, that is significantly different. And if it's not, then we don't have anything to offer. The real arena in which we are to work and witness and win others is the world, or we have ceased to be the light, salt, and leaven. The Christian duty requires courageous participation at the frontiers of public concern, education, mass media, politics, law, literature, and the arts, labor, economics, and the whole realm of cultural pursuits. Let me interrupt the quote for a second. That is why I talk about the extensibility of the gospel, and that's what needs to be preached from the pulpits. Preach from the pulpits is this. And that takes, anyway, I'm not going to go back in some other things. Let's continue with this quote. We need to do more than sponsor a Christian subculture. We need a Christian counterculture that sets itself alongside the secular rivals and publishes openly the difference that belief in God and his Christ makes in the arenas of thought and action. Each of us must find his or her proper station and platform in the fight of the day and use our God-given talent to reflect the truth and justice of God into the world of public affairs. Have you enlisted winsomely and courageously in what Paul calls the fight of the day? And that quote comes from Carl Henry. That's what it comes down to. What are we doing? Are you a bunch of pew sitters? Are you sitting there and taking in, which I have seen in many, especially of the churches of the Gospel Coalition, that you're becoming friends and part of the world instead of setting up that counterculture that shows that distinctive parallel difference? Are you accepting of all that is culturally out there, the perversions, the political misplays, mishaps, the whole perspective of what we just talked about in the last segment in relationship to how government should work, how the Constitution was supposed to work. Just a quick note out of Madison in the Federalist 45 was that the number of individuals employed under the Constitution of the United States will be much smaller than the number employed under the particular states. There will be consequently be less of personal influence on the side of the former than the latter. The members of the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments of 13 or more states, the justices of peace, officers of militia, ministerial offices of justice, with all the county corporations and town officers for 3 millions and more of the people intermixed and having particular acquaintances with every class and circle of people must exceed beyond all proportions, both in number and influence, those of every description who will be employed in the administration of the federal system. Ladies and gentlemen, when we take and we look at that tie point of law and constitutionalism and covenant and these challenges of how Christianity sets that counterculture in place, it is about that restoration of the truth. Mr. Bongino, it's not about what type of country do you want. It's what about Madison just said, what type of country are you supposed to have? What is it supposed to have look like? When you take and what we saw from 1870 and the change of how law has been taught to the present, the moral and spiritual disconnect that we, the people in America, no longer understand the principles of God's law to the extent now that judges will make up law, judges will qualify what they want based on how they perceive the needs of humanity or the people that they are overlooking, and the attorneys fighting for what? They're fighting for illegal stuff instead of what is constitutionally sound. And then we have what? As a result of everything, we have a bloated government. We have a federal government that is so out of sorts because We don't understand the law. We don't understand that distinction that those anti-federalists understood. We don't understand that distinction that Samuel Adams understood, and are able to define that based on God's law versus man's law.